The sentencing hearing of Wayne Couzens has brought the grim details of the murder of Sarah Everard into the public domain. It's now apparent that in committing his horrific crime, Wayne Couzens exploited to the full extent his job as a police officer. Up to now, it had not been public knowledge how Sarah Everard had found herself in Couzens' car. We now know that Couzens abducted his victim by faking her arrest. That involved handcuffing her after claiming she had breached COVID guidelines. The BBC report. Couzens showed his warrant card before restraining Miss Everard, putting her in his hire car and driving away. The 48-year-old had worked on COVID patrols in January and so would have known the appropriate formal terms regarding potential breaches. The whole kidnapping took less than 5 minutes. Astonishingly, the court was told that a couple travelling past in a car had witnessed the abduction, but they assumed Miss Everard must have done something wrong. Following the kidnap, Couzens drove to a remote rural area where he raped Sarah Everard. The court was told she was killed by strangulation with Couzens' police belt. It wasn't until a week after her disappearance that Everard's body was found in a woodland stream in Ashford, Kent, just metres away from land owned by Couzens. Let's go back to the BBC report. They write, her body and clothes had been put inside a refrigerator and set alight before being moved in builder's bags. The court heard that a couple of days after burning Miss Everard's body, Couzens took his wife and 2 children on a family trip to the woods. These details are just more horrific than we could have imagined. Dahlia, I want to bring you in. What response can we possibly have to what we've learned today?
This case is incredibly difficult to hear about. It's incredibly difficult to listen to. I think that obviously there is an issue here where when you have an entire group of people, i.e. the police, who have the state backing to essentially violate and force people's bodies, and it is seen as something that you cannot question, and that if you dare to question the right of someone to do that, of one of these groups to do, a member of this group to do that, you are heavily criticized, you are accused of all manner of things. And whenever you have a system that is designed in that way, you are going to it's not so much that you're going to give cover to the odd bad apple, but you're actually engendering the conditions for abuse and violence to take place. We know that this issue is much bigger than Sarah Everard. We know that between 2012 and 2018, 600 accusations against police officers were raised of a sexual nature, and only 119 of those were actually upheld. So the vast majority of those are not upheld. But when it comes to the question of sexual violence and policing, I think it's important to remember 2 things. First of all, we have the obvious case that, when it comes to gender-based violence, that police are not only responsible for perpetuating gender-based violence, but also, anyone who has approached a police officer, anyone who has gone to a police station after experiencing a sexual assault will know that you are essentially re-traumatized when you go and you speak to the police. I know for a fact that you will have questions like, why did you go back to him? Why did you let him take that photo of you? Why did you send him that image? Why did you? So all of these, so there's this sort of well-documented mishandling of sexual violence claims by the police. Sarah Everard is actually a unique case in the sense that this is actually not the typical way in which we see sexual violence at the hands of the police take place. It's not typically an off-duty cop who, kidnaps someone off the street. It's actually much more endemic than that. But how many times have you heard jokes, offhand comments about rape in prison? How many times have you heard jokes about dropping a bar of soap in the prison showers? Those are essentially jokes and the normalization of the fact that sexual violence is seen as part of the punishment of incarceration. It's seen as part of the justice of criminal justice, and whether that's, creating particular conditions of violence and trauma that lead inmates to harm one another, or whether it's sexual violence and sexual abuse coming from officers towards inmates. When you look at strip searches, when you even look at stop and search, if you speak to anyone who has been a victim of stop and search, it's violating, it's violating, and it's violating in the fact that someone is able to exert control over your personhood and you are not allowed to question it or ask anything about what is being done to you without threat of even further violence. And so when we talk about sexual violence and policing, it's important to address how, so many cops that have, accusations like Wayne Couzens had, like accusations of sexual misconduct against them, how they are able to continue to not only be police officers, but actually gain more and more power as police officers, but also how our prison system, how our system of policing that is supposed to be there to keep us safe from sexual violence, not only is inadequate in dealing with sexual violence, but is actually one of the biggest systemic perpetrators of sexual violence in itself. You can't create a system that has sexual violence at the heart of it in the way that I've just outlined and not expect that to bleed out in ways that you might not have predicted. So I think it's important to talk about specifically what happened in this instance and how we can ensure that there are no more Sarah Everards, but also understand how this wider culture and this wider logic is actually embedded in parts of policing and parts of the prison system that we actually consider to be normal business as usual.
What are your thoughts on, I suppose, on this specific case about how something like this can be made sure never to happen again? I was listening to the radio today with a female police officer. I think she was high up in one of the police forces. She was saying that one thing that needs to happen is police officers need to be, trained, and it needs to be really put forcefully that they should be calling out their colleagues if there is any sign whatsoever that they are abusers, that they are the kind of people who will perpetrate sexual abuse. And she was saying, and she sounded like she was pretty confident about this. This is not happening right now, and there are a lot of police officers who are, not necessarily the next Wayne Couzens, but who are people who could well be doing it already, using their position as a police officer to abuse people. I don't know what else you think would be a sort of commensurate response.
I mean, I don't think that the issue is lack of training of people to call these things out. I'm sure that people do call these things out, although what I would say is that anyone who's been on a demo, particularly a demo that is critical of the police, will see police acting violently and aggressively in a deeply unnecessary manner, and will see their colleagues standing by and, letting them have at it. So I don't think that the training is the issue. I think we need to really understand that if you're going to give a group of people the state backing, there are very, very few instances in which you actually need to physically touch someone. And what we know about the police is that they do it wantonly. They do it without, it's seen as such an everyday, nothing thing to sort of arrest someone and bundle them into a car and take them off to a police station. It's a mundane thing to beat the shit out of protesters at a demo. It's seen as a mundane thing to stop someone while they're, getting on the bus or doing something mundane and demand that they empty all their pockets and that you can pat them down and even take them to a cell and strip search them. This is an incredibly huge amount of power, which, as you know, I know we've had disagreements on policing, but I don't think it's something that actually prevents or solves violence and harm. I think that whole process, even when it doesn't go as far as it did in this situation, I think it actually perpetuates trauma and harm amongst people. I don't think it really protects or helps them. But even if you're going to have that as a concept, we have to understand that this is just such a huge amount of power, and it's done so with such little accountability and such little transparency, and it's so blasé. And I think that, so there's that kind of issue. There's that issue of our general culture towards the police, where anything that a police officer says goes. And that's something that is, endemic in our media. It's endemic in our culture. Obviously we're also dealing with the murder of Sabina Nessa. And there have been some conversations about how, oh, like visibility for Sarah Everard has been so much bigger than Sabina Nessa, and you know this is related to the fact that Sabina Nessa is a woman of color and Sarah Everard is a white woman. And so that is probably true. It is probably true that, you know, there are more column inches, there are more sort of, there is more shock, there's more sort of fear or media attention towards a white woman victim than a brown woman victim. But I think it's really important to note that both women are still at the end of the day are still in the same position. They still were both killed by a violent man. And Sarah Everard has still not gotten justice. And what I mean by that is, first of all, justice would be her having never been killed in the first place. But the changes that actually need to happen are unlikely to actually happen despite that visibility and despite that recognition. And so as much as, yes, there is a question of white, I mean, I don't know if you can call any victim of a murder privileged in any way, but there is a sort of a sense of unevenness and visibility. But at the end of the day, visibility and conversation doesn't actually get justice. What gets justice is systemic change. And what I believe that systemic change has to look like is a radical shift away from policing as the way that we deal with social conflict and social issues. Because more often than not, all the police do is traumatize people, harm people, who then go on to do more harm within their community because of how they've been traumatized by the police. And even when they aren't the perpetrators of that harm, they don't actually have the tools and the ability to deal with harm when it has taken place and to deal with actually helping the process of healing when people have been harmed. So we need a radical move away and reduction of the role that police play in society. Because at the moment, what we have is a dynamic where the state has withdrawn all of the small mechanisms that it might have for offering care, for offering well-being, for offering welfare, and an absorption of all of that into the militarized, violent arms of the state. So we see an expansion of policing at the same time as we see a reduction in welfare. As much as Sarah Everard she might be in the front pages, we might be hearing a lot about her, we might be having a lot of these conversations. What matters isn't visibility. What matters is if that visibility actually gets change. And I don't think that from the way that this story is being narrativized, which is very much still bad apples in an otherwise healthy tree, really suggests to me that we're going to get to where we need to get to.
We disagree on the end goal. Do we want to reform the police or abolish them? I think we can both agree that what has happened here shows that this is more than just a bad apple. This is an institutional problem in the police, and it requires an institutional response. One final thing I'd say on this is that I thought was particularly interesting comments surrounding this is people were saying, you know, God, it must be so awful to have been that couple who witnessed this and went past the police, and you can't blame them for going past, because, you know, they would have expected a cop to be arresting someone if, you know, they had a right to arrest them. What I did hear said, though, was even if they had, you know, gone up to that person, if you ask a police officer, what are you doing? Why are you arresting this person? If you ask someone who is being arrested, oh, do you know why you're being arrested, etc., what you will get is abuse from the cops. They'll tell you to go away and threaten to arrest you. So we do live in a society where it's seen as deeply suspicious to ask what authority the police are acting with. And, you know, this in an extremely extreme way shows how dangerous that is, and why we all should embrace this idea that when the police are doing something, everyone in the vicinity has a right to know what it is and what power, what authority they're using to try and limit the number of abuses which we know are carried out on a very, very regular basis.